Peter and I have two adorable boys, Colin and Barry. And this is our son, Colin. Colin was much loved, very highly regarded, and lived life to the full whilst enriching many other lives around him. He loved his car and all things motoring, and would have given Jeremy Clarkson a run for his money. He had a very eclectic and sometimes puzzling taste in music, and more puzzling still, he was a fan of Blackburn Rovers. His greatest passion, however, was horse racing. As a manager in Ladbrokes, he found his dream job, and I'm sure he would have worked for free, except the money helped him to fill his beloved car with petrol. He and my husband Peter lived for their annual trip to the Galway races. We lost Colin over 7 years ago, and our lives will never be the same again. Nothing will ever fill the empty space in our hearts that this tragedy has left. I have come here today to introduce you to Colin, to tell you his story, to tell you what went wrong with his care, to describe what we did to seek an acknowledgement of failures that had occurred, and to highlight some groundbreaking developments that have taken place as a result of what happened to him. Colin was born over 34 years ago with a congenital heart problem, for which he had many operations during his life, but he managed nonetheless to live a normal life. He was admitted to the Mater Misericordiae University Hospital in Dublin early in 2005, suffering from an infection, which resulted in him having to have corrective surgery, which included the removal of a Dacron patch, stents, pacing system, and epicardial pacer on the 22nd of June 2005. Although a very risky procedure requiring great skill, the operation went without incident. Following the surgery, Colin was placed on a course of prophylactic antibiotics, and initially he made an amazing recovery. He was even leaving the hospital during the day to try to regain some sense of normality in his life, having been in hospital for several months. We were all so excited about getting him home. In the week prior to his death, however, while his surgeon was on holiday, Colin's condition began to deteriorate rapidly by way of an escalating rash covering his body. He suffered from fever, vomiting, and diarrhea. Colin had not been able to eat for days and became extremely weak as his body became drained and battered by a severe drug reaction. We could see his condition rapidly deteriorating before our eyes, and we tried desperately to make people take it seriously. Colin was too sick and too weak to fight his corner, and we all felt like we were living a total nightmare. Eventually, after several frenzied and desperate phone calls for assistance, Colin's cardiologist intervened. He immediately took action by ordering that all treatment of antibiotics be stopped. We were so relieved that we had been listened to and that Colin's complex condition was being assessed and treated by a senior doctor. But, regrettably, having Colin under the care of his cardiologist did not result in the full and immediate care he required, as he was still in the surgical ward awaiting transfer to the medical ward. The following morning, his former surgical team passed him by, glanced at his now purple skin colour and bloated body, and as he was no longer their patient, did not give him their medical assistance. When he was finally transferred to his new ward that evening at 7 p.m, it was too late. Amidst the horror of having to stand by and see our beloved Colin suffering, our world fell apart later that night when he could no longer continue fighting and his heart failed. He was 26 years old. After Colin's death, we had many issues and concerns regarding the standard of care that he had received. We were determined not to let Colin's suffering pass without comment. We could not grieve properly until we had done him some justice. We obtained his medical and nursing files, and Barry spent many hours painstakingly going through them, which helped us to piece together the events of the days leading up to his death. It took a huge amount of time, but more significantly, it took huge physical and mental energy. But we had a strong sense that Colin had not been treated as he should have been, and that we did not want another person to suffer as Colin and our family had. We did not know exactly how to go about making a complaint, but with the help and support of the Irish Patients Association, we made a formal complaint to the Mater Hospital in October 2006, over a year after Colin's death. Our complaint letter raised the following issues. Why was Colin subjected to antibiotic treatment for so long when he was obviously reacting negatively? Why did the surgical team refuse to communicate openly and respectfully with us when we expressed concerns? Why were proper records not maintained of Colin's complaints and symptoms, as these would have identified his escalating adverse reaction? We found numerous inaccurate and contradictory notes in the nursing and medical charts, as well as gaps in reported symptoms. Had Colin's presenting symptoms and his treatment been recorded accurately, his lethal reaction to the drugs could have been identified earlier and treated. Why were the side effects of prolonged use of antibiotics never explained to Colin or his family? Why was Colin allowed to become so dehydrated and undernourished? Why did Colin not receive the regular and competent medical care he required? If the treating consultant is the person ultimately responsible for a patient's medical care, how can they be allowed to go on holidays without formally signing over this major responsibility to another specific person? Eventually, after many written communications, a meeting was arranged for us with key hospital staff, including the consultant cardiothoracic surgeon and the consultant cardiologist in August 2007. At this meeting, we became aware that no formal handover of Colin's care had taken place when his surgeon went on leave, as there was no procedure in place within the healthcare system to formally hand over a patient's care between teams within a hospital. This to us was very hard to believe. It was agreed that an internal review should be undertaken by the hospital with an independent chairman, the first of its kind in the Mater Hospital. This review got underway in December 2007, and we were given the opportunity of meeting with the review team before it commenced its work. When we received the review team's report in April 2008, we initially had mixed feelings. While it had addressed many of the concerns which we had raised, some unanswered questions remained. The issue of accountability haunted us, and we wanted to know how the team's recommendations would adequately ensure that all medical staff complied with the newly proposed policies for patient care. We decided to contact the Office of the Ombudsman for assistance, as we did not know whether the report had been accepted by the board of the hospital or whether any of the recommendations would be implemented. We met with an investigator and explained our position to her. She contacted the hospital and established that the chief executive and the chairman of the board intended to endorse the recommendations of the review team, and that we would be invited to meet with them for the final signing off. We were heartened to learn that once this happened, the recommendations would actually be implemented and we would be kept regularly advised of progress. The recommendations of the independent review covered most of the points in our complaints, and as follows. They recommended that a new policy on assessing for and documenting drug allergies and adverse reactions be reinforced through training and education forums. They recommended better communication with patients and family members and the use of formal, structured family meetings where appropriate. They called for the implementation of record-keeping guidelines. They called for the inclusion in induction training of a greater emphasis on communication between staff and families. They recommended the appointment of another clinical nurse specialist. One of the unfortunate coincidences in Colin's care was that his nurse specialist had gone on leave around the same time as his consultant, leaving one of his potential advocates absent. They recommended improved procedures for the return of personal belongings. In the midst of our grief, we suffered terrible distress from having physical reminders of Colin's suffering presented back to us in a manner that disrespected his dignity. Most significant for us, however, was a recommendation that could impact on many other patients' lives in the future. The review group made a recommendation to develop a policy to address the clinical handover of patients from one team to another throughout the hospital by way of a formal document to be signed by both doctors. This was the first of its kind in Ireland, joining only 4 other countries worldwide that use this system. The policy was formally launched in the Mater in July 2009. Following our request to do so, the hospital's executive dedicated the policy to Colin's memory. We feel that all hospitals have a moral obligation and responsibility to safeguard the welfare and lives of their patients so that they and their families are spared the pain that we have had to live with these past 7 years. A motorcycle courier must formally sign a parcel over to its intended recipient, yet a human being in their most vulnerable and fragile condition and in need of complex medical care that junior doctors may not be always competent to provide is at the mercy of an antiquated system of verbal agreement and assumptions between consultants. At a meeting with the Chief Executive and the Chairman in January 2009, we were presented with a letter from the consultant cardiothoracic surgeon in which he apologised to our family on behalf of the cardiothoracic, medical and surgical teams in the hospital with regard to the circumstances surrounding Colin's death, and very much regretted the hurt and pain that Colin and we endured in the last week of his life. He also indicated that as a direct result of Colin's case in particular, the cardiothoracic surgical department changed its process in handing over care. The Chief Executive later apologised on behalf of the hospital and gave us a guarantee that all of the recommendations made by the team would be put in place, and that he would accept ultimate responsibility and accountability for them. This is what we needed to hear. The letter we received from the CEO of the hospital was also deeply comforting. It includes the following important extract. Thank you for meeting the chairman, the team and I this morning. Once again, can I record the hospital's sincere condolences on the death of your son Colin and apologise for all the pain and suffering arising as a result of his care and treatment in the Mater Hospital. This was a long and painful journey for us, but strengthened by Colin's unwavering bravery and spirit, we fought hard to effect change to prevent a repeat of this tragedy. We were heartened by the efforts made by the administrators and clinicians in the Mater Hospital to accept responsibility and embrace the need for change. We are grateful to those people in the hospital who admitted that failings had occurred and agreed to right them in the future, those who showed us compassion and treated us as human beings rather than potential litigants. Financial compensation was never on our agenda. Instead, we simply wanted answers, information, explanations, solid reassurances that what went wrong would never happen again. We wanted a proper and meaningful apology. All of this we got, and all of this did bring us some relief. Although not a day goes by that we do not think of Colin and grieve for his absence, the life he could still be living. Making our complaint about Colin's care has helped us. We have gained satisfaction from knowing that our actions will hopefully improve the lot of others. Making a complaint can make a difference, but it is not easy. People need information and support. I would like to call on all those organisations that work with people who make complaints to act fairly, attentively and respectfully in what can be a very difficult process for all parties. In searching to sum up what effect Colin's experience and his death has had on me, my husband Peter and son Barry, we came up with these words. To lose a child is beyond comprehension. To lose a child who suffers is beyond pain. But to lose a child who suffers needlessly is beyond agony. Peter and I have been blessed with 2 wonderful sons. Indeed, only for Barry, none of this would have been possible. And finally, if I may, I'd like to share one of my most precious and abiding memories of Colin. It was while he was recovering back in the ward after his surgery. And Peter and I went in to visit him as usual. And Barry was already with him. And I went in and I began to straighten his bedclothes and fluff his pillows the way a mother would. And Barry just said to me, "Stop fussing, Mum." So I looked at Colin and I said, "I'm not fussing, am I, Colin?" And he just smiled and said, "That's your job." We miss our Colin. Thank you for your attention.